George Luz was presented as one of the more memorable members of Easy Company in the Band of Brothers television series. In reality, however, relatively little was written about him, particularly when compared with men such as Richard Winters, Carwood Lipton, Donald Malarkey, and William Garnier. Outside David Kenyon Webster's memoir, Parachute Infantry, information about Luz is surprisingly limited. Stephen Ambrose mentioned the famous incident in which Luz imitated an officer and tricked Captain Sobel into ordering fences to be cut, but offered few other details about his wartime experiences. When asked about his life, Luz provided only a brief account of what happened after the war. He shared almost nothing about his combat service apart from his recollections of the D-Day jump. Nevertheless, Luz was widely regarded as one of Easy Company's natural comedians. His impressions, jokes, and ability to lift the spirits of the men helped make him a popular figure within the company. This reputation was probably one reason the creators of Band of Brothers gave him a larger role in the television series. What follows is everything I have been able to find about George Luz, including the only known letter he sent to Stephen Ambrose and his personal recollection of the Normandy jump. Dick Winters also included a short comment about Luz, although part of it appears to be aimed more at Buck Compton than intended as a tribute to Luz himself. George Luz Jr. has spoken about his father in several YouTube videos, and I have watched most of them. These recordings contain a few valuable stories and pieces of information, but it appears that George Luz Sr. rarely spoke in detail about his wartime experiences. As a result, much of what is known about his personality and service still comes from Webster's Parachute Infantry. One particularly entertaining story told by George Jr. concerned the release of Saving Private Ryan. When the film premiered, Dick Winters strongly encouraged the surviving members of Easy Company to see it. Film footage even exists of Winters helping to promote the movie. George Luz and his son went to the cinema together to watch it. When the film ended, Luz Sr. turned to his son and bluntly asked, "What the hell was that?" Despite everything he had witnessed during the war, he apparently had plenty of criticisms of the film and was not afraid to express them. Dick Winters offered his own description of Luz while collecting material for Ambrose. He began by saying, "George Luz, here is another man who cannot write." According to Winters, when Luz was asked to contribute his memories several months earlier, he replied that he had never learned how to cross his T's and dot his I's properly. With some encouragement, however, Luz admitted that his daughter had offered to write down his stories if he would record them onto tape. Winters hoped that this arrangement might finally produce some of George Luz's wartime recollections. Winters remembered him as a man with a wonderful sense of humor and a loyalty to Easy Company that was second to none. He then referred to an incident at Bastogne involving Buck Compton. According to what Winters had been told, when Compton broke down and began walking towards the rear, Technician 5th grade Luz chased after him and tackled him into the snow in an attempt to prevent him from leaving. Winters concluded that this demonstrated the kind of man Luz had been during the war, and remained many years later. On June 7, 1991, Luz wrote a short letter to Professor Stephen Ambrose describing his life before and after his military service. He explained that he had entered the Army on August 25, 1942, and had been discharged on December 1, 1945. The first thing he did after returning home was give his father $40 to cover the cost of his bed and board. After that, he allowed himself a month away from work. His first civilian job was in a used furniture store, where he earned 75 cents an hour. He remained there for approximately 4 months before finding work as a painter for $1 an hour. As Luz jokingly observed, things appeared to be improving. A little more than a year later, he faced what he humorously described as another date of entry, although this time it was into marriage rather than military service. At the time he wrote the letter, he and his wife had been together without separation for almost 45 years. Luz eventually secured a position with the federal government, beginning on a wage of $2.88 an hour. He held that job for 7 years before losing it during a reduction in the workforce. He later obtained employment with the state and eventually entered semi-retirement, working 3 days a week while leaving himself enough time to play golf. Luz and his wife raised 3 children and had 6 grandchildren. In retirement, they enjoyed life together, including what he jokingly called the art of losing money in places such as Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and Reno. They also greatly enjoyed attending Easy Company reunions. Looking back on everything he had experienced, Luz admitted that his life had been a wonderful one. He signed the letter simply and proudly, George Luz, E Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. On June 5, 1992, Luz attended the New Orleans publication celebration for Band of Brothers. During the event, he publicly told the story of his D-Day jump for the first time. True to form, he began by warning the audience to prepare themselves for a few lies. He asked them to imagine him wearing a leg bag that seemed to weigh around 150 pounds. Like many other paratroopers that night, he lost the bag during the jump. Inside the aircraft, the men boarded in reverse order, with number 18 entering first, followed by 17 and 16. Lieutenant Harry Welsh was positioned behind Luz in the stick. Luz was so heavily loaded with equipment that it required 2 members of the Army Air Force's ground crew to lift him into the aircraft. Before continuing, he referred to Private Roy Cobb, another Easy Company soldier whom Welsh had recently mentioned. Luz explained that the men were lined up inside the aircraft and that he was 5th in the jump order, convinced that he would never make it to the door with all his equipment. He told Welsh that he did not believe he could get out of the plane. Welsh suggested that he exchange places with Cobb. Luz then reminded the audience of what happened to Cobb, who was struck by enemy fire in the backside during the flight. As the aircraft crossed the French coast, a crewman opened and removed the door. Looking back on the experience, Luz believed that airborne transport aircraft should never have carried removable doors in the first place. During a combat jump, every second mattered. If the aircraft had been hit and the door had remained secured, the paratroopers might not have escaped. Luz believed that if this had happened to his plane, he would not have survived to tell the story. He asked the crew chief for the time, and was told that it was approximately 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. They continued flying for another 4 or 5 minutes before the red warning light illuminated, signaling the men to stand to prepare to jump. German fire then struck the aircraft and shattered the light. Cobb was wounded and announced that he could not stand. Despite the confusion, the order was given and the paratroopers began leaving the aircraft. Luz jumped into the darkness, and 48 years later he joked that he was still searching for the leg bag that had been torn away from him. He came down alone in an orchard, separated from the rest of his stick. After landing, he accepted that if the Germans were going to find him, there was little he could do about it. He moved towards a nearby hedgerow just as another transport aircraft passed overhead. Looking up, he watched another paratrooper descend directly into a group of trees. Soon afterwards, Luz heard the sound of a recognition clicker. The paratroopers had been issued small metal devices that produced a distinctive clicking sound, allowing them to identify one another in the darkness. Luz kept his clicker inside a small pocket near the switchblade knife on his uniform. Unfortunately, the buckle of his chest strap had crushed it during the jump. When he reached inside and attempted to press it, the device produced no sound. The man approaching him turned out to be Larson from Headquarters Company. The two remained together for a while before Luz noticed someone caught high in a nearby tree. They walked beneath the branches and quietly told the stranded paratrooper to come down. The man's response was so colorful that Luz refused to repeat it in front of the children attending the event. Instead of climbing down, the paratrooper told them to take something with them. A moment later, Luz heard an object land heavily on the ground. When he picked it up, he discovered that it was a medical first aid bag. The man trapped in the tree was a medic. When Luz was questioned about the incident again in 1998, he clarified that the medic never climbed down while they were there. Luz and Larson eventually left him in the tree and continued moving through the countryside. It was approximately 9 o'clock in the morning when they finally located and rejoined Easy Company, nearly 8 hours after Luz had jumped from the aircraft. The best-known George Luz story remains the incident involving Captain Sobel and the Wiltshire farmers during training in England. Stephen Ambrose described how Luz possessed a remarkable talent for imitating voices. One night, Easy Company was leading the battalion during a cross-country march. Progress was repeatedly delayed by barbed wire fences stretching across the route. Captain Sobel was near the front of the column when a voice called through the darkness, asking him what was causing the delay. Sobel answered that barbed wire was blocking their path. He believed he was speaking to Major Oliver Horton, the battalion executive officer. Still imitating Horton's voice, Luz ordered Sobel to cut through the fences. Sobel immediately answered, "Yes, sir," and called for men with wire cutters to come forward. Easy Company continued its march, leaving a trail of opened and damaged fences behind it. The following morning, a furious delegation of Wiltshire farmers confronted Colonel Robert Strayer. They complained bitterly that military personnel had cut their fences and that their cattle were now wandering freely across the surrounding countryside. Strayer summoned Sobel and demanded to know why he had ordered the fences to be cut. Sobel replied that he had been following a direct order. When Strayer asked who had issued it, Sobel named Major Horton. Strayer informed him that this was impossible because Horton was on leave in London at the time. Sobel was severely reprimanded for the incident. However, he never discovered who had imitated Horton's voice and therefore could not punish the man responsible. Luz's impersonation had worked perfectly. Luz was also portrayed in the Band of Brothers episode, The Breaking Point, during the devastating German artillery barrage that killed Alex Pencala and Warren Skip Muck. In his own written recollection, Luz explained that Easy Company had moved forward to occupy a different position. It was already late in the afternoon when the men began digging their foxholes. Luz was ordered to return to battalion headquarters and collect several large shovels. What happened after he returned was almost impossible for him to describe. Muck and Pencala, two of his closest friends, had already prepared their foxhole. Because Luz had not yet dug one of his own, they offered to let him share their position. Describing himself humorously as a stubborn, thick-headed Portuguese, Luz refused their offer and decided to prepare his own shelter. He eventually dug a narrow slit trench, measuring approximately 6 feet long but only 1 foot deep. Soon afterwards, German artillery shells began exploding throughout the area. One round landed extremely close to Luz's position. When daylight arrived the following morning, somebody asked him to wake Muck and Pencala. Luz looked into their foxhole but could see nothing except loose earth. Realizing what had happened, he jumped into the position and began desperately digging with his bare hands. Eventually, he felt their sleeping bags beneath the dirt and pulled both men from the destroyed foxhole. Muck and Pencala were dead. Their position had received a direct hit. Had Luz accepted their invitation to share the foxhole, he almost certainly would have died beside them. Perhaps the most entertaining description of Luz was written by David Webster and concerned an incident at Haguenau, where Easy Company was sent after the Battle of the Bulge. Webster recalled hearing someone pounding and clattering across the road before rushing into a garage and bursting into the room where the telephone was located. It was George Luz. He carried a bazooka in one hand and a bag of ammunition in the other. Completely out of breath and with sweat covering his face, he announced that he had run the entire way. He eagerly demanded to know where the Germans were and insisted that somebody point them out so that he could blast them. Luz then slipped into an imitation of comedian Jimmy Durante. He joked that shooting at the Germans was as easy as shooting fish in a rain barrel and claimed that he had not enjoyed himself so much since shooting his mother-in-law. Still laughing, Luz declared that he had given the Germans a reveille they would never forget. He then told the men that whenever they needed somebody blasted, they only had to telephone and ask the operator to connect them with Luz. These scattered accounts provide only a limited picture of George Luz's wartime service, but they reveal the character of the man behind the famous television portrayal. He was courageous under fire, fiercely loyal to Easy Company, and capable of finding humor in even the darkest circumstances. His impressions and jokes did more than entertain the men around him. During exhausting marches, terrifying artillery barrages, and long periods of uncertainty, they helped sustain morale and briefly reminded the soldiers that laughter was still possible. George Luz may not have written extensively about the war, but the stories preserved by Winters, Webster, Ambrose, and his own family ensure that his distinctive personality has not been forgotten. He was Easy Company's comedian, but he was also a dependable paratrooper and a loyal friend who shared the dangers, hardships, and losses experienced by the men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. What was your favorite George Luz scene in Band of Brothers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe.